It's time for the moment you've been waiting for. Da, 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 da. Da, 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 da. Da, 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 da. Da, 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 da. Da, 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 da. Tsh, da, 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 da. Di, da, di, di, da, di, di, da, 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 da. Dilly, da, dilly, da, dilly, da, dilly, da, dilly, da, di, di, da, di, di, da, di, di, da.
The 12 Principles of Animation.
The 12 Principles of Animation were first introduced to us by Disney animators Ollie Johnson and Frank Thomas. Ollie Johnson's first work was done on Pinocchio, which he directed in 1940. After that, he was non-stop contributions to Disney's animation, such as Snow White, where he got to work alongside Frank Thomas. Frank Thomas was born in Fresno, California. Frank Thomas attended Stanford University, where he worked on campus humor magazine, The Stanford Chaparral, with Ollie Johnson, who would end up being his go-to man for pretty much his whole life. After graduating Stanford, he attended Conard Art Institute, then hopped right over to work at the Walt Disney Company. There he animated dozens of feature films and shorts. Them being two of the best animators Disney has, it had helped land them a job as one of the 9 old men, who were made up of 9 retired animators that were put in charge of mentoring the students of Cal Arts. Ollie and Frank were both amazing animators, so when they got together, history was made. Literally, they wrote the book The Illustrations of Life, Disney Animation, the book that we follow as animators to produce the best work. It holds the 12 important techniques Disney has developed over the years. These techniques are considered the 12 principles of animation. Now let's get right into it. The 12 principles of animation. Principle 1, squash and stretch. Squash and stretch is the principle in which the animator applies the contrasting shapes from squashed form into a stretched out form, or vice versa.
I have to take one.
Hey guys, why don't you just wet your hair and say you had a shower?
Isn't that lying?
I prefer to call it creative truth. Quick, give me your towel. I'll block the pipe.
This process gives the animation a feel of flexibility and life, while also giving the viewer a feeling of weight. Without squash and stretch, the animation feels stiff and so unreal. With less squash and stretch, the feeling of heaviness is given. Squash and stretch also doesn't have to be applied to the entire body. Simply bending the knees of a character and straightening them out is an example of squash and stretch. It is important to understand at what time should the object go from squashed down to stretched out. Principle 2. Anticipation. Anticipation is used to make an animation look more organic and not robotic. It usually comes before the action. If a person is jumping into the air, there needs to be a hold of them bending down in order to get that feeling that they are about to jump. It informs the audience to know that an action is about to take place, using slight movements and gestures. This allows for the audience to be aware that the action will happen as to not be caught off guard. Anticipation there is to help build suspense. Principle 3. Staging. While staging is just as important as every other principle, at times it is often looked over. Staging is where the rule of thirds comes into place. It applies to any form of entertainment. It is important to know how to stage things even in drawings because it allows for the audience to know what the main focus of the scene is and where they need to be looking. Acting, timing, cinematography, and setting all fit under staging. The main focus of the scene needs to be obvious as the main focus, but it should not be the center of action. Putting the main character on one point of the grid lets you know that your staging is correct. Principle 4. Straight ahead action versus pose to pose. This principle lets the animators know that there are multiple ways to approach the animation. Quoted in Illustration of Life, Disney Animation by Frank and Ollie. Straight ahead animation starts at the first drawing and works drawing to the end of a scene. You can lose size, volume, and proportions with this method, but it does have a spontaneity and freshness. Fast, wild action scenes are done this way. While pose-to-pose is more planned out and recorded in an organized manner, this is where posing is focused more on. The character should move to make each scene more interesting. Principle 5. Follow-through and overlapping action. This technique is where extra props, body parts, and appendages follow behind the main action. Follow-through is where objects apart from the main body, such as a cape or pants, will move slightly behind the main body's movement. Follow-through and overlap helps to add a feeling of realism to the character. This is one of the most important principles since it deals with attention to detail and framing whether a frame needs to be on its own layer. Principle 6. Slow in, slow out. This principle is where we make full use of how things move in real life, whether it is real or fiction. Slow in and slow out is the way an object would start slowly, then builds up speed, only to end slowly. From a ball falling to the ground after being tossed up to, it will go up slowly, then catches some speed while falling, then soon enough after hitting the ground. A few times it will slow down and soon enough come to a stop. This allows for the animation to not feel so mechanical or robotic, unless the object is a robot. This is where in-between frames are important. The more scenes added, the slower a scene will be, and vice versa.
Principle 7. Arcs. As animators, we use tools such as arcs to help add accuracy to movement and bring the illusion of live motion to animation. In life, our movements are not stiff and straight. They tend to have curves and use circular motion. This use of arcs as a device in animation helps the animation feel much more alive and have a natural flow. Principle 8. Secondary action. The principle of secondary action is that this motion supports the primary action of the character, and this helps give the subject more personality. These secondary gestures help the main motion seem more natural.
辻見習いって感じでいいと思うわ。
おっと、面白いこと言ってくれるな。ここが貴族の屋敷じゃなかったら、えらい目に合わせていたところだぞ。なあ、ララティーナお嬢様。ララティーナお嬢様はやめろ。俺は親父さんに頼まれてしまった。娘が粗相をし。
Principle 9. Timing. Timing in an animation is used to present the speed on how fast or how slow an object or character is moving. The animator is able to create this movement based on the amount of spacing within a drawing in multiple frames. For example, when the drawings are set very far apart from each other, the animation appears much more faster. But when the drawings are very close to each other throughout the frames, the animation moves at a slower pace. Principle 10. Exaggeration. Exaggeration allows the character's actions to be much more dramatic and extreme to emphasize their actions even more. This is done so by distorting facial features, object size, and expressions. For example, if a character is walking very depressed, in order to exaggerate this depressing walk, the animator can make the character lean their body much more forward and lower to exaggerate the character's upsetting walk. Exaggeration makes the animations more convincing to the audience. Principle 11. Solid drawing. Solid drawing is used to make the character feel as though they are in a three-dimensional space. The animator must learn to draw the figure from all angles in order to get the principle right. When creating the character, it is best to start their structure with three-dimensional shapes, so that the animator knows from what angles to draw the characters in. It is also best to avoid symmetry lines because it makes the objects or characters seem flat. At last, our final principle, Principle 12, Appeal. Appeal is when the character is interesting and pleasing to look at. Enlarging a feature on the character that stands out most helps give more personality to the character as well. The best way of making characters appealing to look at are with dynamic designs. And in order to do this, there are 3 helpful steps. The first step is variety of shapes. It is best to practice and test what types of shapes an animator would like to use on their character, and what would best fit their personalities. The second step is to play with proportions. Animators use this by enlarging certain parts of the character that the audience would find more interesting to look at, and lowering the size of certain parts the audience will pay no mind to. The third and final step is to just keep it simple. Adding way too much detail to an object or character makes it difficult for the audience to focus on one particular thing. Keeping it simple helps the audience focusing on the importance.